Hi class, it's Dr. DiBiase, and tonight we are going to be talking about process and response. And we'll kick this off by talking primarily about process. We'll touch a little bit on response, but we'll save most of that for the next video, just to keep this one a little bit shorter. So let's get going. Let's start with La Motte, right? So everyone read Shitty First Drafts. And I think one of the reasons that we kick off this unit, right? We kicked this unit off on Monday with La Motte. Was her piece in a very sort of affirming and humorous way, or at least I believe it's sort of an affirming and humorous piece, tries to help us as writers rethink our attitudes towards process, right? And I would argue, I guess, that if there are four key points that she's making, right, they are that all writers, or almost all writers, struggle at times. And I would argue that it really is all. She sort of jokingly refers to that maybe there's some writer out there that doesn't, but we don't like that person very much. The idea that the perfect is the enemy of the good, I actually really like that saying. It's a kind of a cliche, but I think the article kind of touches on it, and I think it's valid. That process should be intentional, and we'll talk a little bit about that in conjunction with the Nancy Summers piece, which I didn't ask you to read, but you may want to take a look at. And the importance of metacognition, and she doesn't use that language, but I'll talk about why I think what she's arguing at the very end of her piece constitutes a discussion of metacognition. So all writers struggle sometimes, and I'm kind of laughing at the visual rhetoric here of what PowerPoint suggested I use for this slide. So this poor king down here is apparently is struggling. But La Motte's point is sort of this, right? When you look at a piece of published writing, whether it is an article on the web, whether it is in a newspaper, whether it is a novel or a poem, all you see is the finished product, right? You, generally speaking, do not get to see the mess that's going on behind the scenes. And I'm actually thinking about this now. My daughter is a very big fan of Frozen 2, as most 6-year-olds are. And you look at the movie and it's incredible. It's Disney. It's incredibly well done. It's very polished. But a new documentary is coming out, may have already released, that kind of covers the final few months of the production of the film. And it's chaos maybe is too strong of a word, but there's some really major discussions and decisions that are being made up until almost the last minute in terms of how the film is staged, how it's edited, what songs are included, etc. But as the viewer, you almost never get a window into that, right? Unless someone comes along and sort of deconstructs it for us. And that's the case with most writers, right? When we encounter most sort of writerly writers, right, we're only seeing their best work because it's gone through multiple revisions. It's probably passed through an editor or two, but we don't get to see that process. We have no window into it. And so what La Motte tries to do here is unpack that and sort of take us behind the curtain a little bit and say, no, actually, we have the same kinds of struggles that you do as well, right? That we all have moments of frustration with our writing or struggle with our writing, that it doesn't just pour out onto the page in its final version, right? That's sort of a myth, right? And if we go back to chapter 1, it's a kind of myth that plays into that traditional story of writing, right? That good writers are born, not made, right? That you just happen to be a good writer, and if you are a good writer, writing comes easily. But I think the irony here is that being a good writer does not mean that the writing comes easily at all. I think I'm a relatively good writer. That does not mean that I find writing to be an easy task to do, or even an enjoyable task to do in many cases. And so La Motte wants us to really think about this idea that we don't see the whole picture. And if we could see the whole picture, we might actually feel that we are more capable of engaging in writing work, right? Because one of the things that maybe holds us back is this sense of, well, what I write will never be as good as what I am reading. And the reality is that, I mean, it's true in the sense that it's not going to, because what you're writing isn't going through the same rigorous process of revision and revision and revision in most cases. And because you maybe have less experience with writing, right, you don't engage in it to the same degree as a published author, and so you haven't had the time to build up the experience to produce what you might see in a published edition of something. So it leads us to sort of ask the question then, what is it that separates effective versus ineffective writers if it isn't just something like that you're born with? Well, Nancy Summers tried to answer this question in her sort of critical study on the composing habits of student writers compared to the composing practices of what she called experienced adult writers. I don't love her terminology because, like, y'all are adults, and I'd rather say novice writers than student writers because I don't think it's specifically a feature of student writing. I think it's more just a feature of novice writers. And she conducts this study. She does a bunch of interviews to try and figure out how these different groups of writers engage in the revision practice. And what she finds is that there are some really significant differences in, again, to kick it back to chapter 1, the conceptions that these writers have about what revision is, what its purpose is, how it operates. So what she found was that for a student writer, the focus is primarily on the sentence level. A lot of emphasis on things like word choice. If I could just find the right word to express my thoughts, then I would solve my writing problems. And I've seen this, and I've been teaching first year writing now for over a decade, and I commonly run into students who, when they come into class, will ask me, well, how do I improve my vocabulary? I feel like I don't have the words I need to do what I need to do as a writer. And obviously vocabulary helps, but a point that Summers makes with respect to some student writers, she looks at a particular example of a student who did some sentence level revision. Figuring out the right word might solve the problem of like accurately saying what you want to say, but it does nothing to ensure that what you're saying is original or interesting, or that you're just not saying the same thing you said earlier, just in a different way. And she describes their process, right, student writers or novice writers, as having what she calls sort of a linear approach to revision. And when we say linear, we mean it sort of proceeds in a line, right? Step 1, step 2, step 3. And I think that can be a little bit counterintuitive in the sense that, when we go back to Lamont, she says I have these kind of 3 stages of my drafting, and you might say, well, that's linear too, but it's not, and I'll explain why. For the student writer or the novice writer, there's a sense that I have what I want to say in my head before I begin the writing, and then I just write it down. And then at the end, I'm just sort of tweaking little things to make sure it sounds the way I thought it should sound. But for the experienced writer, right, this writer has a sense of revision that's more about finding the argument and what Summers refers to as like the shape of the argument. And so the revision is less about, I know exactly what I want to say, so now I have to tweak my writing to get to say that. It's more about, as I go through these various stages of drafting, I am coming closer to understanding, what is that I actually want to say in the first place and how my argument should be structured, right? So this is where Summers, brings up this idea of this process being nonlinear. It's nonlinear because on the one hand, you might go into a writing project with a sense of what you want to say, but in the process of writing itself, you may generate new ideas or new ways of thinking about a particular topic that change what it is that you want to say. And this might lead you to revisit your ideas and produce yet another draft. And so a word that I like to use when it comes to revision is the word recursive, right? When something is recursive, it moves back and forth in various stages that kind of repeat. And I think that that's probably the most accurate way to describe a good revision practice, right? That you go in with a sense of what you're trying to do, but you're open to the possibility that in the act of writing, you will come up with new ideas. And so when we're thinking about revision, right, we need to think of writing as a way of thinking, right? Writing down information, right? Writing our ideas down helps us. It doesn't just record, right, what you have to say. It helps you find new things to say or new ways to say those things. It helps you identify connections that maybe you would not have identified otherwise. But that only works if you go into the process with an open mind. And I always like to just sort of break down the word revision, right? Re means to do something again. Vision is to see, right? So revision is sort of a way of seeing things again or seeing things from a new angle. and in the process opening up new possibilities for your writing. Now the tough thing here, right, is that this requires time. And if you are someone who is inclined to, for example, put drafts together late in the process, and I'm as guilty of this as the next person, particularly when I think about my early college career. I was the king of putting stuff together at the last minute. Like that was sort of my my default setting. But the problem there is it does not leave you sufficient time to find the potential in your writing. And it's not until you actually give yourself that necessary time to kind of play with language, play with ideas, give yourself some room to grow in your writing, that you'll really figure out just what you're capable of. And I remember, even if I felt good about submitting a paper at the last minute because I got it done, and sometimes there was that sense of, haha, I did it, there was also kind of a letdown in the sense that I knew that whatever I was turning in was not what I was capable of, right? That it could have been better. And I try, you try to push that sort of aside. But as I've become more experienced as a writer and as a scholar, right, I've learned that that's just not the way to it's not the best way to make a good impression. It's not the best way to find your best ideas. It's not the best way to develop yourself as fully as you can. So I'm hoping that certainly by the end of this course, this is something that will internalize a little bit and sort of shift our practice. And we'll talk more about that as we go. So again, Lamott, talks about 3 drafts, and I don't think we should literally think about this as 3 distinct drafts. Now in this class, we'll think of it a little bit more in that literal sense, but when you're operating outside of the context of a compressed time schedule and you have more time, right, you may have 1 or 2 or 3 shitty first drafts. You may have different versions of an updraft, etc. So what are these things? Well, she talks about the shitty or the downdraft, and this is this gets back to the point of the perfect is the enemy of the good. If you go into your paper and you are striving for perfection, you will be paralyzed to write anything interesting, anything truly interesting. And instead, you have to give yourself permission to just get your ideas down. Give yourself permission to screw things up. Give yourself permission to take some risks, or give yourself permission to feel comfortable with the fact that you are uncomfortable in the situation. A number of you have mentioned in your office hours with me or emails to me that you're feeling a little bit stuck on the assignment or it's challenging, and I will concede it is a challenging assignment. Like, there is no question about that. I've given you a very difficult writing task to do, and so the reality is you're going to be faced with tough writing tasks throughout your college career and your postgraduate career. Whether you're going into industry or you're starting your own business or going to grad school, you're going to face all sorts of novel writing tasks that are going to pose challenges for you, and you will not know immediately how to handle them. And so rather than being fixated on, I have to know exactly how to do this the right way right now, I think it's much healthier and much more productive to learn the skill of saying, okay, let me sit with this and figure it out. And it might be a process, and it might be messy, but I'm going to come out the other side having learned a few things that are going to stick with me for the next time I encounter something like this. So when we're working on that shitty or that downdraft, which you have been working on to this point, right, the goal is not to even come close to approximating the final version of the document. The goal is to just get as many ideas down as you can so that you can work backwards and figure out what's working, what's not, what has promise, what could be expanded, etc. And Lamott even says she tends to, she frequently finds herself writing, twice as many words as she can actually fit in the final version of the document. And she tends to write shorter pieces. If you're writing for a magazine, they'll tell you only have like 1,000 words to work in, or 700 words to work in, or whatever. But she'll go double that, and then from there she'll have lots of material to sort of sift through and figure out what the best things to work with are. And again, the more you write, the more options you give yourself, so that you can work with the best of your ideas. From there, she talks about the updraft, right? And she talks about that in terms of trying to say what she's trying to say, more with greater clarity, or more intelligently, or with greater focus. And what I would argue here is that it's not just about trying to pin down exactly what you want to say. It's at this stage of the draft where you're really trying to figure out what Summers again refers to as the shape of the argument, right? You're figuring out what works, and in the process of putting those pieces together in that next draft, you are getting closer to what the final version will look like, but not because you had the perfect version of what that final thing looks like in your head to begin with. It's because in the process of sort of organizing, moving things around, cutting paragraphs, expanding paragraphs, you begin to see how the pieces might connect in a good way. And I'll tell you, there's really nothing like the feeling as a writer when you're writing and you see a connection that you didn't see before and you figure out how to progress your piece. And those moments don't always come frequently, but when they do come, I think they're incredibly satisfying. And then when we move along, right, we get, once we've finally gone through that stage of drafting, looking at what we've done, considering our arguments, thinking about where we can go into different directions, figuring out if I go in one direction, what opportunities does that open up and what does it foreclose, right? Eventually we get to this point that she talks about as the dental draft, right? Check every tooth. This is where you begin worrying about when now you've gone through the entire process and do feel very confident in the arguments that you're trying to make or the story that you're trying to tell. And I can mean, story both in a literal sense of like a fiction story, but also just the broader narrative of your research. Now you can begin going through and really carefully considering things of the choice, the level of word choice, the mechanics that you're using to make sure that you are being as effective at that level as you can be. But again, this comes generally speaking towards the end of not always, but for the most part, the bulk of this kind of work takes place at the end of the drafting process, because let's say you write a paragraph and it's perfectly executed in terms of like grammar and punctuation, and we'll kind of throw out those notions next week anyway, but let's for the moment, let's say you did. If the paragraph isn't very good, right, the ideas just aren't very interesting and you have to get rid of it anyway, then why did you spend all that time trying to nail down the punctuation, right? Better to get the ideas down and then assess whether or not it's even worth keeping before you get too invested in what you've done with it. And this is, again, an instance of this idea of intentionality, right? You're making choices about how you're doing things. These various drafting stages play particular roles in how you move from initial idea to a final product, but it's not always going to be a straight line. And I think that Summers refers to it at one point, and I'm actually going to flip in my textbook to make sure I nail the language on this. Right, she refers to it as a seed, right? That she says in this model, right? Quote, writing appears to be more like a seed than a line, right? And that's on 153. So this idea that you're not thinking about the process of writing as first, second, third, fourth. You're thinking about in terms of there is a process to move through. There are different stages that I can move through, but I may be moving back and forth across those stages as I get closer to what it is that I actually want to say. Finally, I want to close on an idea that Lamott brings up, which is the idea of, she doesn't call it metacognition, but I'm going to use that term because it's a good word. It's a good word to know. And it simply means the ability to think about one's own thinking. And we get this when she starts talking about those voices in her head. And I want to assure people these are metaphorical voices. They're not like, she's not literally hearing voices in her head, right? But she's trying to identify the experiences, the individuals, the insecurities from her past that have a direct impact on her ability to give herself the freedom to write. And that's hard to do. I am no stranger to sort of struggling with this. I was working on my dissertation and I had probably 3 good months of writer's block where I just could not get ideas down because I was so anxious about the writing. Now you guys don't have 3 months to like work through this. So like, sorry, not much I can do about that. But I share that because I think it's important for you to know, that there are things that can hold you back as a writer, and it's important to try and identify what those are. And it's not always easy to do that, right? But if you can think about what holds you back, if you can think about what shapes your process and where it comes from, then you can begin to think about disrupting that process when it's not working for you, right? And eventually, most processes stop working for us at some point until we gain a certain amount of experience. And so when we think about, how do we disrupt the process, I think about, one way that we can do this is by really kind of critically reflecting on what we're doing and try to make active changes in our approach. So like when you finally say, I'm not going to start this the night before, I'm going to give myself 2 days or 3 days to kind of think this through. Or if you're someone who's not used to like reaching out to a professor or a teacher when you have questions, right? Saying, you know what, next time I'm going to do that. I'm going to do it earlier than I did last time, so I have more time to work with that feedback. Another way is to get feedback from other individuals, right? Whether it is, myself as your professor or members of your peers, right? Other students in the class who can provide a different kind of perspective on the work that you are doing. And so, as we make our way through the writing in this course, we will have multiple opportunities to provide feedback to each other, and I'll be providing feedback to you as well. And the goal of the feedback is always, always, always to help you develop as a writer. It's never about, I'm never going to say, well, if you were to do X, Y, and Z, you would get an A on this paper, because that's not how grading works in this course. Instead, what I'm going to say is, if you do X, Y, and Z, it's going to improve the quality of this piece in these ways, right? Here's why you might want to do it in this particular way, or why you might want to revisit this particular idea, or, oh, I see that you didn't really include a sample of some evidence here. Here's why you might want to do that. And my hope is that, both based on all the feedback that we're going to be giving one another and based on the fact that the way that grading works for this course, you have the freedom to sort of experiment and give yourself permission to play around with ideas and worry less about putting together the perfect paper, that you will be able to cultivate the necessary habits that will enable you to productively address any kind of writing task that you come across, both during your time at Fairfield and beyond. So I'm going to leave it off there. We'll talk more about giving each other's response in the next video. Hope you're all doing well.